Welcome to the ultimate breeding guide for Palworld. If you want the most overpowered pals, then understanding breeding mechanics in this game is essential. In this video, we're going to cover everything you need to know about breeding in the game to help you create any pal you want with the best passive skills and stats. I'll cover how you can breed pals like this ultra-fast Jetragon with perfect passive skills to make it as quick as possible. The super efficient Anubis that makes resource gathering and production super easy. And even this overpowered Shadowbeak with perfect traits and stats to make it as strong as possible. With that, let's get started. So how does breeding work in Palworld? Like other games, you'll need to pair a male and a female pal together, but what pal you receive is a little different than other games. Each pal has a hidden breeding power number between 10 and 1500. The lower the number, the more rare or powerful that pal generally is. Chickapee, who's a very basic pal, has a breeding number of 1500. Shadowbeak, who is an epic pal, has a breeding number of 60. Taking an average of these two numbers gives a breeding number of 780, which would correspond with Battalia. If the average doesn't match exactly, then the game will choose the pal with the closest power. If there is a tie, then the tiebreaker just comes down to the pal that comes first in the game's index. Because of this mechanic, you can never breed a pal that is stronger or rarer than the parents, but you can take advantage of this mechanic to breed pals in between. There are exceptions to this mechanic too, that use special combinations. These combinations do not use the breeding power method and will always result in a particular pal. This can be used to combine two less powerful pals into a more powerful one. Kitsun, who has a breeding power of 830, and Astagon, who has a breeding power of 150, should give an average of 490, which should be Cinemoth, but instead will actually give you a much rarer Shadowbeak. I will include links in the description for a list of the breeding power numbers for each pal, as well as a link to all of the special combinations. I'll also put a link to the breeding calculator that I use, which can tell you the results of combining any two pals, as well as the possible combinations to get a particular child pal. This calculator is my go-to when I'm breeding in Palworld. Using this mechanic, you can chain breed to get a particular pal, while also passing on valuable passive skills and stats that we'll cover later in this video. Before we get into how passive skills and hidden stats are passed down through breeding, we should discuss the actual breeding process. Breeding the perfect pal is a lot of trial and error, and that means you're going to need a decent breeding setup, which you unlock at level 19. Ideally, you should have a couple breeding farms built so that you can speed up the process. I have 3 separate farms at my breeding base. More importantly, you're going to want to have a good farm setup for producing cakes, since you're going to need a lot of them. You'll need these ingredients to make cake: berries, flour, milk, eggs, and honey. You can grow wheat and berries using plantations. In my breeding base, I have 4 wheat plantations and 3 berry plantations. Milk, eggs, and honey can be produced at the ranch by assigning the right pals to it. Milk is made by assigning Muzarina, eggs by assigning Chickapee, and honey by assigning Beeguard. You also need a mill to crush the wheat into flour. I have 2 ranches at my base for a total of 8 pals that I can assign to produce ingredients for making cakes. Since you only need 2 honey to make a cake, you probably won't need more than 1 Beeguard, so I would focus more on eggs and milk production. I will talk more about the PAL Essence Condenser later in this video, but it is definitely worth upgrading your ranch pals as much as possible and as soon as possible. For each rank, they will produce an extra resource, and will go from producing 1 resource per cooldown to 5 at max level 4. You can buy all of the ingredients from merchants, but unless you have a lot of gold to spare, you should probably set up a decent farm with all the cakes you're going to need. You are also going to want to make sure you have a good cooking setup. Cake takes a really long time to craft in this game. You can start making cakes once you unlock the cooking pot at level 17, but I would recommend you get the electric kitchen as soon as possible. You also need a pal with the kindling work suitability. Ideally, you're going to want level 3 or 4. Jormuntide Ignis is the best kindling pal in the game with a level 4 in the suitability and will make cake production much faster. You can actually breed one fairly early on in the game, though you will have to grind using a slower kindling pal at first. Large dragon eggs, which contain Jormuntide Ignis, can also be found in the volcano biome located southwest on the map. If you are using this method, you'll need level 2 heat-resistant gear at a minimum, such as the tropical outfit, heat-resistant pelt armor, or a heat-resistant undershirt. The last thing you will need too is an egg incubator, which you can unlock at level 7 with ancient technology points. Without any bonuses, huge eggs typically take about 2 hours to hatch. However, you can reduce incubation time by adjusting the warmth level to suit the egg type. Blazing eggs need a lot of heat, while frozen eggs prefer cooler temperatures. Also, if you want, you can adjust the time it takes to incubate in the game settings, which includes making it instant. This is actually what I have my game set at, which helps a lot with all the eggs you'll need to hatch, especially if you want the perfect stats and traits. But ultimately, this is up to you. Once you get the breeding farm and cake production set up, you're ready to move on to breeding for traits, which are passive skills that provide various buffs or debuffs to either players or the PAL. These skills can randomly be found on PALs in the wild, but the best way to get the exact traits you want is by having PALs inherit them through breeding. PALs can have a maximum of 4 passive skills, and it's not possible for a single PAL to have multiple copies of the same trait. The process for how traits are assigned to the PAL when breeding involves 2 key chance-based roles, an inheritance roll and a mutation roll. The inheritance roll determines how many passives are inherited from the parents, while the mutation roll adds random passives if there are available space. The inheritance roll happens first. Depending on how many traits will be passed down from the parents determines whether there will be a mutation roll. If less than 4 traits are being passed down, then the game will do a mutation roll to see if extra traits will be added that the parents did not have. If during the inheritance roll, the game decides to pass down the maximum of 4 traits from the parents, then the mutation roll is actually skipped. This is a key part of the breeding mechanics and can help make breeding for the perfect PAL more consistent. Other important mechanics to be aware of is that both parents having the same traits does not increase the odds that the child PAL will end up with those traits. When the game begins the inheritance roll, it looks at all the traits that the parents have, but if there are traits that repeat, the repeated traits are just ignored. This means that you just have to make sure that between the 2 parents, one of them has the traits you are looking to pass down. The distribution can be 2-2, 3-1, or even 4-0, where one parent has all the traits you're after and the other has no traits. It's just important to make sure that the 4 traits that you are after are the only traits available in the pool of possible inheritance traits between both parents. So, what are the exact odds for the inheritance roll? The odds of passing down only 1 trait from the pool of parent traits is 40%. Passing down 2 traits is 24%, passing down 3 traits is 12%, and finally, the odds of passing down all 4 traits from the parent's pool of traits is 10%. Now that we know how the inheritance roll works and what the odds are, we should talk about the mutation roll. During the mutation roll, there's a 60% chance that the mutation will be added to the child PAL. This is a random trait that neither of the parents' PALs have. This can be beneficial if the game adds the exact trait you are looking for, but given how many traits there are in the game, and a lot of them are actually negative, using the mutation roll to your advantage is not a great strategy. Instead, the goal is actually to avoid the mutation roll, which is random, and instead pass down the exact traits you want. The odds of not passing down a mutation is 40%. Here are the odds of getting a particular number of traits from the parents and not getting any extra traits through mutation. The odds of passing down only 1 trait from the pool of parent traits without any mutations is now only 16%. The odds of the same both 2 parent traits is now only 12%, and 3 traits is only 8%. Now this is where it gets interesting. Like I mentioned earlier, the mutation roll is skipped if there are at least 4 traits in the parent trait pool. This means that the odds of passing down the 4 parent traits is still 10% and not 4% like if you had to worry about the mutation roll. This is great news, since it means that as long as between the 2 parents you only have the 4 traits that you are targeting, you actually still have a 10% chance of getting a child PAL that has exactly the 4 traits you want. This works out so that roughly every 10th egg you hatch should in theory be the PAL with perfect traits that you want. Now, if between the 2 parents there are more than 4 traits, the odds of getting the perfect PAL with the traits you want goes down significantly. You still don't have to worry about mutations, but there are just more options that the game can pick from than the 4 maximum you can have on a PAL. The odds of getting the exact 4 traits you want, if there are 5 traits between the 2 parents, is now only 2%. The odds get even lower the more extra traits you throw in there. 6 traits is 0.67%, 7 traits is 0.29%, and 8 traits is a terrible 0.14%. These odds start to get really bad and make even the mutation odds look good. The goal is then to obviously have the exact 4 traits between the 2 parents that you want so you don't have to worry about mutations, but no extra traits that would bring down the odds of getting the exact combination that you want. So, with all that information, there are really 2 different ways you can go about breeding a perfect PAL. The first, and more crude method, is to continuously breed the PAL you want with the same PAL and just rely on mutations to introduce that trait you want. Then, as you start accumulating the traits you want, you can breed out the undesirable traits. The problem with this method is that there are so many traits that the odds of getting the exact one you want are actually pretty low. This method is really only useful for PALs that do not rely on the breeding power mechanic or special combination mechanic that I mentioned earlier. This would be legendary pals and any other pal that can only be produced by breeding with the same pal. We'll go more into how to best use this method after, but first we should cover the inheritance method of breeding traits that would apply to the majority of pals that you can breed using different types of pals. This method involves taking 4 pals that each have one of the traits you want and breeding them together to get 2 pals with the traits you want. Then, you can breed these 2 pals together and get a pal that has all 4 traits you want. Once you have this pal, you can use a simple breeding calculator to tell you the easiest way to chain that pal into an actual pal you want with the exact 4 traits that you started with. This method works best if you already have a large number of random pals with various traits to choose from. The first reason being so that you can actually have 4 pals to breed with the traits you want. The second reason is so once you get that random pal with all 4 traits on it, you can then chain breed it with other pals that either don't have traits on them or don't have any traits you don't want, so you're not introducing any extra traits into the pool and lowering your odds. Don't worry, I am going to go through an example which should help explain this method better. I wanted to create the perfect worker Anubis for my bases. This Anubis will have the traits Serious, Work Slave, Artisan, and Lucky, which all increase the work speed of this pal. So to start, I went through my pal box and found 4 pals that have just these traits. The first pal I had was a Muzarina that had the Artisan trait. I paired this pal with a Fwak that had the Work Slave trait. You do need to make sure that one pal is male and one is female, so you might need to be a little flexible on which ones you are using. Now, using the breeding power number, or just using a simple pal breeding calculator, a Fwak and a Muzarina will give you a Leespunk. Since there are just 2 traits between the 2 parents, and we are aiming for a child pal with those exact 2 traits, and no random traits through mutation, our odds are 12%. This means it should take about 8 or 9 breeding attempts to get this Leespunk. It's important to note that these are just odds, and you can get lucky and get the pal you want faster, or unlucky and have to hatch extra eggs. I got my desired Leespunk after 8 attempts, which matched the odds exactly in this case. The next 2 traits I am targeting is Serious and Lucky. I have a Jolthog that has Serious, but Lucky was a little more challenging for me. The only pal I had with this trait was a Liftmonk that also had the trait Musclehead, which I didn't want. This isn't a deal breaker, it just means that I have to hatch a few extra eggs to only get the 2 traits I wanted out of the possible 3. If you do have 2 pals that only have these 2 traits, then your odds are again 12%. In my case, because I had 3 traits, the odds became only 4%, which means I should have to hatch about 25 pals to get what I want. This is not ideal, but it just goes to show that this method is flexible and you just need to know how to adjust. Jolthog and Liftmonk result in a Foxparks. Fortunately, I only had to hatch 14 Foxparks to get the one that only had the 2 traits I wanted. Also, if at any point I'd gotten a Foxparks that only had the Lucky trait, which is the trait that was tied to the other trait I didn't want, I would have started trying to breed the Serious Jolthog with the Lucky Foxparks. The odds of getting the Lucky Foxparks are actually 5.33%, and if you then start breeding these 2 pals together, your odds will go back up to 12%. This comes back to the fact that the best way to get desired traits is just to remove the ones you don't want and only breed with the ones you do want. Just something to be mindful of. Now that I have a Leespunk with Artisan and Work Slave, and a Foxparks with Lucky and Serious, I can breed these 2 pals together to get a pal that has all 4 traits I want. Because there are only 4 traits to inherit, the odds now become 10% of getting a pal with just these traits, which works out to about every 10th egg to get the desired pal. Fortunately, I did get a female Leespunk and a male Foxparks, but if you end up getting 2 males or 2 females, you are going to need to either keep hatching or adjust your breeding chain. Breeding a Leespunk with a Foxparks gives a Kelpsie. It only took me 7 attempts to get a Kelpsie with all 4 traits I wanted on it. Now at this point, I need to start chain breeding towards the pal I want with the traits I want on it. I am looking to get an Anubis, so I need to figure out the easiest and shortest way to get there. Looking at the possible combinations to breed an Anubis and comparing with the pals I had, the easiest chain for me to breed was my perfect Kelpsie into a Digtoise, and then breed that perfect Digtoise into an Anubis. The easiest way for me to breed a perfect Digtoise was to breed my Kelpsie with a Mosanda. Ideally, this Mosanda should not have any traits on it, otherwise you will lower your odds below the standard 10%. Fortunately, I had a Mosanda with the trait Artisan, which one of the 4 traits are already on my Kelpsie. This worked out well since the odds don't change if both parents have the same trait. It did take me about 12 eggs to get the Digtoise I wanted, which is only slightly worse than the odds of 10% or 10 eggs. Finally, I can then breed my Digtoise with a Jormuntide that I had to get my perfect Anubis. Unfortunately for me, the best Jormuntide I had to work with also had the trait abnormal. This meant that I had 5 possible traits, which lowered my odds of getting a perfect Anubis from 10% to only 2%. This would work out to having to hatch roughly 50 eggs to get what I wanted. While this isn't terrible odds, especially since it's the home stretch, there is a way to actually improve the odds if you're going into the same situation I am. Once you start hatching these eggs, you'll likely get a bunch of pals that have an almost perfect set of traits and don't have any undesirable traits. We can then take advantage of this by stopping from breeding the other 2 pals that have the 5 traits and just start breeding the 2 almost perfect pals, since as long as between the 2 of them they have the exact 4 traits we want, our odds will actually increase back up to 10%. This is what I ended up doing as soon as I had 2 compatible pals, since I would only need to hatch another 10 eggs or so to get what I wanted. This only took me about 30 eggs total, which is way less than the 50 that it should have taken where I didn't have a perfect trait pool. Again, you only need to worry about this if you have too many traits. If the last 2 piles you're combining just have the 4 traits you want, you can just keep breeding them, since you still have the exact same 10% chance. So here's my perfect worker Anubis with the 4 traits I wanted. I bred a few more of them once I got my odds back up to 10%, and now I can breed more of them with very little effort. Like I said before, this is the recommended method for non-legendaries. The method to get a perfect legendary, or any other pal that you can't breed from another pal, is a little more tedious. Like I mentioned earlier, the only way to introduce the new desired traits into the trait pool without catching them in the wild is through mutation. You basically just have to keep breeding until you get a trait you want through mutation, and then start breeding out any undesirable traits. I really wanted to breed the fastest possible jet dragon that has legend, swift, runner, and nimble, which all make it as fast as possible. I started with 1 jet dragon that had legend and divine dragon, and another that had both of these plus musclehead. There are about 60 traits available at the time of making this video, and you should get a random trait through mutation about 60% of the time. This means it should take about 100 eggs to get all the desired traits that you're looking for. I actually ended up having to hatch 150 jet dragons until I had all 4 traits I was after. Once I actually got the 4 traits I wanted, I had to start breeding out the extra traits that I had picked up along the way. As I began breeding these pals, I would swap out the pals anytime I ended up with a new one that had less undesirable traits on it. Slowly, I was able to breed out all the undesirable traits and end up with 3 sets of jet dragons that I could use to then start trying to get one with all 4 traits on it that I wanted. It took about another 100 jet dragons to finally end up getting the one that had all 4 traits on it that I wanted. But wow, was it ever worth it. This pal is incredibly fast now. So now that we know how to breed a pal with perfect passive skills, next we should talk about how stats work. In Palworld, hidden stat values, or sometimes called IVs or individual values, are values that influence a pal's attack, defense, and health. Every pal has a unique value for each of these stats that ranges from 0 to 100. The higher the value, and the higher that particular stat will be, especially as the pal levels up. If you want to see what a pal's IVs are in game, then you'll need the ability glasses, which are unlocked at level 34 using ancient technology points. If you don't actually have access to this item, you can also use a free IV calculator online, where you just need to enter the stats and traits of that pal, and it will tell you what the pal's IVs are. The calculators do get more accurate as the pal levels up. I'll leave a link in the description for the IV calculator in case you don't have access to the ability glasses. So how do IVs work with breeding? Similar to how traits are passed down, there's an inheritance and mutation system, though it's a lot more straightforward. Basically, the game will do 3 rolls, 1 for each stat, and decide if the stat is being passed down from one of the parents or a random mutation. The odds of inheriting IVs for each unique stat during breeding are 30% from the father, 30% from the mother, and 40% chance that it's just a random mutation. This means that there's a 60% chance of an IV being passed down from either parent for each stat. This works out to a 22% chance of inheriting all these IVs from the parents. If you combine this with the odds of getting all the traits you want, you end up with only a 2% chance of getting a pal with perfect IVs and all the traits you want. The odds get even worse if both parents don't have perfect IVs. If, for example, only one parent has perfect attack and defense stats and the other has perfect health stats, then you only have a 30% chance for each of the desired stats to pass down from the particular parent you are targeting. The odds of passing down everything you want is now only 3%. Combining that with the odds of perfect traits, and you're at a measly 0.3%, which is not great. If you do want to breed pals for both ideal passives and max IVs, one strategy is to first start by aiming for a pal with either no passives or no undesirable passives and maxed out IVs in one or more stat. You might have to compromise though and go with a pal with as few undesirable traits as possible to start. It just means you'll have to breed those traits out as you go. Once you have these max IV pals picked out, you can then start to breed them together until you have a pal with all 3 stats maximized and hopefully no unwanted passives or as few as possible. Depending on what pal you end up with and what pal you are trying to breed, you may need to chain breed this perfect IV pal towards a combination that will give you what you want. Next, you will want to breed a pal with the 4 desired traits you want. I would use the previous method I showed to get a pal with perfect passives. Similarly, you may need to chain breed this pal as well towards a combination that gives you what you want. Once you have a pair of pals where one pal has perfect IV stats and the other has perfect traits, you can then start breeding these 2 pals together. There are 2 goals here. The first is to breed the perfect pal by getting lucky and getting all the IV stats from the desired parent and all the traits from the other. This is possible, but unlikely. The second and more likely goal is to create perfect IV pals with almost perfect traits. By doing this, you will eventually end up with a breeding pair that has perfect IVs and between the 2 of them have the 4 traits you want. Finally, breed these pals together until you achieve max IVs and all 4 desired passives in one offspring. Once you have the perfect breeding pair, the probabilities are 22% to inherit all 3 IVs from either parent and 10% to inherit all 4 passives. Combining these probabilities gives a total chance of about 2.2%, or roughly 1 in every 46. This method does take quite a bit of effort, but is the most reliable way to get almost any pal with perfect IVs and traits. The other advantage of this method is that once you create a pal with perfect IVs and little to no traits, you can then use this pal as a template to create other perfect pals. This method unfortunately doesn't work on Legendaries and any other pal that you can't breed from another pal, since you can't chain breed in either the IVs or the traits. Don't worry if this isn't perfectly clear, I'll go through another example, this time showing how I got my perfect Shadowbeak. I first started by sorting through my pal box to see what pals I owned that had at least 1 perfect IV stat. I ended up having quite a few and even got lucky and had one that had 2 perfect stats. I then started to breed these pals together to start working towards a pal with all 3 perfect IVs. I ended up getting super lucky and quickly got a Gory Rat that had 3 perfect stats. I then started to chain breed this pal towards a Shadowbeak. I decided to breed this Gory Rat into a Kitsune with perfect stats that I could pair with an Astagon with the desired traits I wanted. Once I got my Kitsune with perfect IVs, I turned my attention to the Astagon I needed. I wanted to have the traits Legend, Ferocious, Musclehead, and Lord of the Underworld on my Shadowbeak. Fortunately, I already had a Jetragon with the first 3 traits, and I just needed to get Lord of the Underworld from a Necromus. I bred both of these pals into a bunch of Astagons, and then started to breed them together to get perfect trait Astagon. Once I had my perfect trait Astagon and perfect IV Kitsune, I began breeding them to try for the perfect Shadowbeak. This part of the process took the longest. Like earlier, I kept breeding Shadowbeaks until I got the ones with 1 or 2 perfect IVs and some of the traits I wanted. I continued breeding these almost perfect Shadowbeaks together till I finally got one with all 3 perfect IVs. By this stage, I had all the desired traits in my breeding pairs, but there were still a few extra traits I didn't want. From there, I carefully bred them to remove the unwanted traits while ensuring I kept the perfect IVs through the process. Eventually, I ended up with a breeding pair that had perfect IVs and all the traits I wanted between the 2 of them. This gave me the best possible odds of producing a perfect trait in IV pal. I then continued to breed these pals together, and after some patience, I finally got my perfect Shadowbeak. If you're aiming for a pal with perfect stats, this is the best approach, though it does take a lot of time and breeding to achieve. Another method you could do, which is a lot easier, is to just use the tip I mentioned earlier to use partial success to improve your odds. This will help you get almost perfect IVs, like 80% in each stat, without much extra effort. In this method, I would instead focus on getting perfect traits like I mentioned earlier, but as you are breeding and creating possible breeding pairs, also keep an eye on the IVs. The random mutation rolls a random number between 0 and 100, so it's completely possible to get a really good IV on an egg that also has near perfect traits. You can then swap out one of the other pals with this one to slowly introduce better IVs. This is what ended up happening when I was breeding for perfect traits on my Anubis. The pals I started with really didn't have any good IVs, and the few good ones that they did have didn't end up even passing down. By the time I was breeding for an Anubis with my Digtois and Jormuntide, I only had 1 good IV out of the 6 possible between the 2 parents. But once I got 2 Anubis with the 4 desired traits between them, I started swapping them out for better IVs anytime I hatched a pal with better stats. This is all while I was still breeding for perfect traits. These are actually some of the Anubis I bred that I could keep using as breeding pairs. As you can see, A lot of them now have 1 or 2 good IVs, which came from gradual mutations. I even ended up with this near perfect Anubis with 4 passive skills I wanted and 3 great IV stats. This just goes to show you that you can focus primarily on passive traits and just incrementally introduce better IVs when you get better and better pals. I did a similar thing when I was breeding my fast Jetragon to try and get as good IVs as possible while focusing primarily on the traits. The beauty of this method is that you can still focus on getting a perfect set of traits on a particular pal while improving your odds of getting good IVs. Now that you've bred the perfect pal with all 4 of the traits you want and perfect or near perfect IVs, there is one more step in making this pal as strong as possible. Like I mentioned earlier, we can upgrade the pal to 4 stars using the pal Essence Condenser, which you can unlock at level 14 with ancient technology points. This machine enhances your pal by absorbing the essence of other pals, essentially fusing them into one you want to power up. There is one catch. The pal you use for this process must be of the same type. For instance, I can't use my extra Jetragons to help level up my Anubis. I'll need to use other Anubis pals instead. Thankfully, after all the breeding we've done, you should have a lot of extra pals available for this. To start, select the pal you want to upgrade. It will receive bonuses to health, attack, defense, and more. Next, you'll need to sacrifice several pals of the same type to serve as essence. The number required increases with each level. 4 for the first upgrade, 16 for the second, 32 for the third, and finally 64 for the fourth, totaling an extra 116 pals you need to reach max level. You can also use pals that are already leveled up to fuse into your pal you want. Each level not only boosts your pal's stats, but also upgrades its partner skill, unlocking new features or improving existing abilities. Once fully leveled up, the pal will also gain +1 to all its work suitability levels. For example, an Anubis with 4 in handiwork, 3 in mining, and 2 in transporting would upgrade to 5 in handiwork, 4 in mining, and 3 in transporting. So that's it. Everything you need to know to breed the most powerful pals with the best stats, traits, and abilities. If you liked the video, feel free to leave a like or comment. And if you want to see more content like this, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our future videos. Hope to see you in the next one.